Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Petray with IndustryWeek. In the past decade, climate and geopolitical events and COVID elevated supply chain planning to the highest level strategy. Now, changes in tariff policy that moved along at the glacial pace of government are coming rapid fire and being adjusted on the fly. How does a manufacturing company with suppliers all over the world, as well as in the US, plan around such uncertainty? Today, we're talking to Darrell Edwards, a University of Tennessee system supply chain professor and a former chief supply chain officer and chief operating officer at Lazy Boy Incorporated, and Ji Lee, principal supply chain advisor for J&J Investment and Consulting and a former supply chain director for Boeing, as well as other aerospace and tech companies. Let's start with you, Lee. How are you seeing manufacturing companies pivoting around their supply chains to deal with uncertainty? And have you seen any good practices as well as maybe some misguided approaches?
Yeah, Laura, what I've seen, I would say in the last at least a few years, particularly the large company, they've been basically working on diversification. I think Gartner had a survey, and it's an interesting point that what they find out was those big company, they stated 50% of them have executed, the so-called China Plus One strategy by 2022, and then 80% of them has executed the China Plus One strategy by 2024. So what this tells you is, company has been working on diversification for quite some time, and certainly the one they choose to do that are in a much better position today with all the trade war, the uncertainties. However, the smaller, the medium-sized company, I think due to various different reasons, they haven't quite there yet. So they've been struggling more. They get into this more the reactive, very tactical mode about build up inventory or holding on shipments, finding out some kind of a interim mitigation method. So I would say the good practice that I think is more about diversification.
So the medium-sized companies you see.
Yes.
What, Darrell, do you have anything to add to that? What are you seeing as far as good practices?
I think G did a really nice job of summarizing what I've seen as well. I tended to think in terms of multiples and multiple geographies, multiple suppliers, and I think we learned a lot through COVID-19. And that was kind of the beginning of maybe framing, redesigning our global supply network from a manufacturing perspective. So we saw a lot of companies. I saw a lot of companies looking at redesign, moving certain supply bases from one geography to multiple geographies, making sure that they were not single sourced in certain key commodities or inputs, and making sure they were at least dual sourced and sometimes triple sourced. So diversification, as G said, is really good and a really good strategy. I also see some companies looking at strategic inventory reserves for key commodities so that they can minimize disruption in certain ways, but maybe on a more standard commodities, those are multi-source and it's more of a cost play versus a strategic play. Additionally, after COVID, I saw and continue to see companies look at increasing their visibility through either technology uses, because it seems to be that the more companies that have the best information, greater visibility, they're able to make quicker, more rapid decisions and do so in a very intelligent way. So, a mix of all that, and there's not a one size fits all. It depends on sector, it depends on area and geography and the company size, as G said, but some blend of a multitude of those things, help companies to at least mitigate risk when it comes to disruption.
Darrell, on that note, what fundamentals of supplier development have become even more critical now?
Yeah, from my view, supplier development done well is, about 70% of, at least in my experience, has been your success is going to be executing fundamentals really, really well. And maybe there's, 20, 30% that you do somewhat differently, new, whatever's kind of in vogue or whatever's in style at the moment. But, basic fundamental supplier development is still very critical, from supplier development, from initial stages, boots on the ground, to developing supplier scorecards that are meaningful, to making sure that your supplier has shared metrics with you so that you both understand the expectations and they execute against those shared metrics, at a high level. So those fundamentals are really good. And I tended to look, and we tend to look at maybe doing somewhat of a 360-degree survey in supply base, and look inwardly within the four walls of your business and see, what are we doing really well and what are we not doing really well? Where are our vulnerabilities? And we ask our suppliers, our customers, do the same thing. And I think it's healthy for suppliers then to go backward in that supply base and have them do a 360-degree kind of survey among, their execution levels and their vulnerabilities, and be able to take and try to find out where these issues might be way ahead of the game. So again, fundamentals and a foundational elements from a supply base and supplier development still work really, really well. And again, I will probably mention visibility more than once, increasing your visibility capability so that you have really good information. Develop early warning signals in your metrics so you kind of see bad things about to happen before they happen, so you can make adjustments before it gets critical. So those very fundamental tenets still work, I think, from a supplier development standpoint.
Lee, did you have anything you wanted to add to that about, the fundamentals? And also maybe you could talk a little bit, I know you wrote about this in your IndustryWeek article, that about pressure testing and, some best practices around, maybe you could share some best practices around pressure testing your supply chain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the first thing in terms of the supply development, I view that as basically a collaborative approach between the two to create something that doesn't exist today, or create something better that doesn't exist today. So I don't view the supply development as a kind of a performance improvement. So the fundamental, I think, that doesn't change. It is a collaborative approach that should be able to benefit both sides. So I always kind of, think about this, as a negotiation, as an analogy. My approach is always trying to create something, create a bigger pie for both. And then we can talk about some kind of equitable way of dividing the pie versus, what I'm seeing these days is there's a lot of approach about, okay, I'm going to try to take a bigger slice of the existing pie, maybe even a smaller pie. I think that's the worst of a supply development. So that's kind of just what I see as the fundamental, is that it's a collaborative approach. And then in terms of pressure test the supply chain, I don't think we need much of that today. We already got enough going on. It's already pressure test, probably more than what any company wanted to see these days. So I would say maybe just treat the current environment as a way to pressure test your existing supply chain. And then I see a lot of companies, particularly the big ones, they do scenario planning, right? And then they put into what if the tariff goes on here, goes to this percentage, or the administration decided to tax this nation. What does that mean to my supply chain? How do my competitors is going to react? So these are all good scenarios that we need to think about. My advice will be, once in a while we get good news, like what we heard yesterday, right? There's a bit of relief that got signed.
Right.
So don't just kind of call it good luck and kind of walk away, walk on other busy things. Just think about, hey, what if that didn't happen? What I'm gonna do, what my competitors will do, and how can I get ahead of my competition? That's my approach. That's the approach I would take.
Darrell, is there anything you wanted to add about scenario planning?
I tend to agree. I like personally scenario planning. let's be clear, you can scenario plan a lot, and you're still, when the actual event happens, it's going to play out much differently than you planned for. So that's unquestionably going to happen. But I still tend to think you're more prepared if you do scenario planning than if you don't. And I would submit, let's do scenario planning when times are good, not when times are bad. So let's think about what might happen, and let's think about some catastrophic events that might occur. Let's test the vulnerabilities of our existing supply chain, both backwardly and forward, within the four walls of our business as well. Additionally, I might suggest that our supply base, let's go backward in the supply base, and let's ask our key suppliers with critical components that we are heavily dependent on to do that same pressure testing type events, so they understand where their vulnerabilities are as well, so we don't get caught. Even though we might have done a really good job and planned for certain things, if we don't anticipate one or two tiers deep within the supply base, we could still be surprised.
Lee, you were talking about collaboration with your suppliers and benefiting, mutual benefit. I would imagine communication is important there. Like, how do you communicate to your suppliers, and how often, I guess, that this is going to benefit them as well?
What I find is during difficult time, those kind of a communication actually happen a lot more and much closer than maybe what they used to be. I think there's a multi-layer of communication channel that need to be maintained. When I meet with my counterpart, the question I always ask is, okay, so what do you suggest that, what solution that you could offer? And same thing, and also similar, what do you see other companies are doing out there? Maybe you feel like that's applicable, to my business. So just take that collaborative approach, to see what suppliers can offer, and then we go from there.
Darrell, anything you want to add about collaboration?
No, I do still believe, and I believe collaboration is absolutely one of the key critical tenets, if you will, regarding supplier, vendor relationship. It's unquestionably, that's a big deal. And there's not a one size fits all, but I do think, open transparency, trust with your suppliers is incredibly important. It's hard to hit a target you can't see, so make sure that you're very open and transparent with your suppliers. Have multiple types of communication and frequent communication. And I would even suggest that communication needs to go multi-level within the organization, not at just maybe manager, director, executive level, but within the supply base backwardly as well, and down to the shop floor level, so that you have really understandings and a deep knowledge. So when the communication and the collaboration occurs, it becomes more meaningful.
Do you see, there's a lot of talk about collaboration, but do you see manufacturers still like clinging to the old ideas of like, we have to keep that information to ourselves? Transparent, they haven't really embraced the whole transparency situation.
So, Laura, from my vantage point, obviously, if you're dealing in a public company situation, there's certain things you can't talk about. We all understand that. But things that can be talked about, in my view, the more transparent you are, the better relationship's going to be, and the more successful you will be as a partnership. I truly believe that. And I tend to think that the more information both sides have about the business, the better decisions both sides make. Now, let's be clear on certain commodities, on certain inputs that are cost play. I don't think that's, from my view, it's not as important. If I'm buying commodities that I can buy from 10 different sources and it's a cost play, that's probably not as important. But if I'm looking at key critical components to my business, then to me, collaboration and transparency is incredibly important. And what I can share, if I'm in business, I'm probably going to share.
What about you, G? Do you find yourself talking to your clients about, they need more visibility with their suppliers? There needs to be more sharing?
Yeah, I agree with
Or are they already on board with that?
Yes. So I agree. What you choose to share and how much you share really depends on the type of the commodity and also the type of relationship that you have with the supplier. Just think about from a demand planning standpoint. Supplier rely on us as the customer to tell them how our demand is gonna look like, what might change right during this kind of difficult time, which is for everyone. But suppliers, they're not stupid. They have other sources. They work with other customers. So if you keep hiding a lot of things purposely from them, it's probably not going to help them to help your business. So if for the right supplier, always trying to be transparent about our business, about the demand, and then I would try to also do the same with our customers, so we can have a relative reasonable visibility of the demand throughout the supply chain, particularly for the major players that we all work on basically off the same information.
What do you think? At this point, I'm sure companies are, because they have to diversify their footprint. Well, first off, just talk about diversifying your footprint. Is that something that you're seeing companies having to do more of now with the tariffs? And are there certain regions that they're looking at that they maybe weren't looking at before?
So from a sourcing standpoint, I see certainly India, Vietnam has been probably, you hear a lot more these names compared with a few years ago. And they do offer some quite competitive labor rate compared with China, compared with other regions. So definitely, actually I worked on a few projects, and also during the COVID, that's where I'm going in terms of diversify my supply chain from a component standpoint, not necessarily from a duplicate manufacturing, duplicate my own manufacturing standpoint. So I think these are certainly some of the area of the region of the country or the world that we can look into.
Darrell, did you want to add anything to that about diversification? Any tips for diversifying? I know companies are very different. Different companies have different priorities, but.
Yeah, so Laura, I agree with what Gia said. Hearing the same type of dialogue in the marketplace, I would submit maybe that I believe we started to see a kind of a redesign of the supply chain after COVID. So I really think that a lot of things that we're dealing with now, some of the I won't say fix, but some of at least the strategic planning was in motion as a result of COVID. I think we as manufacturers have spent decades really refining our supply chains to be very cost driven, maybe single sourced and very, very streamlined. And I think COVID disrupted a lot of that single source, very streamlined and international, if you will, sourced type supply chains. So I think companies started looking at where the lines intersect between cost and service. And we started to see a bit of the pendulum swing more towards service was incredibly important, and cost still is important, but maybe not as important. So you started to see a lot of companies that are thinking maybe we need to be multi-source, multi-geography, multi-nation from a sourcing standpoint. And that was starting to happen regardless, I think, of the events today. So I think COVID really began to accelerate the redesign of the global supply chain. And I don't think it's played out quite yet. I think you might see some mix of still sourcing, in parts of the world, whether it be, in Asia or Latin America, and then bringing some reshoring of manufacturing back in the States. And there's be some sort of blend in that, whereas before it might have been sourced more globally outside the borders of the U.S. So I think all that is in motion. It's going to be very interesting from my view to see how that plays out over the next few years. But I do think the disruptive events of the world, coupled with, in my opinion, a shift from cost focus, 100% cost focus almost, to some blend of cost/service focus has caused us as manufacturers and supply chain professionals to redesign that network, and it's kind of in motion at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one thing I would like to add in terms of the global footprint, optimization or creating some resilience, some redundancy. Typically a company looking at, hey, where do I want to manufacture, right? There's a different factors they consider, and then they design a supply chain or global supply chain around that, global footprint. One approach that I've seen is instead of asking, where should I manufacture, you ask, where do I want the country of origin of my products to be? And then you design a supply chain around that, country of origin. It's just a different perspective. I think that actually plays pretty well in today's environment, that allow you to be more purposeful about, which market that you serve, where do you want to create a bit of a flexibility, a competitive advantage for you by re-engineering your country of origin, basically.
We're just about running out of time here, but one more question. I'm just wondering, even with the incredibly high tariffs, are there still valid reasons to source from China?
I go first. Since I grew up in Shanghai, a large part of my career, particularly in the early part, is I did a lot of global sourcing, offshoring. That certainly includes China. And so I would say in today's environment, there's a lot of different reasons. Companies need to understand why do they want to source from China to begin with. As long as they understand the reason that drove them there, and then understand what problem they're trying to solve today, then they can make a decision. Whether do they want to continue to source, or do they want to choose a different strategy. Some of the reason, kind of to answer your question direct, China is still a pretty big market, right? Second to US. So a lot of the company choose to stay in China because of, not only just to source, but also for the market. But they create this called, China for China strategy, meaning that I'm going to maintain my supply chain in China so I can serve the market in China, maybe serve the regional market, but I'm going to create something different for my US supply chain or for my US market. So that's certainly a one perspective, for the company to think about. A different question I would ask is, instead of asking, do I source from China, I would ask, what is the country of origin of the product that I'm sourcing? Maybe you're dealing with a China supplier, but that doesn't necessarily mean the country of origin of the products you buy is made in China. So you need to really understand the second or third tier of the supply chain to gain the visibility Darrell talked about earlier, so you can understand really the dynamics, the risk that you have in the supply chain and how you're going to manage it globally.
Darrell, did you want to add anything to that regarding sourcing from China?
Yeah, I think you said it very well. The first question was asked, why did you go there to begin with? And additionally, I do think it's becoming more cost prohibitive, and especially as G talked about, with countries like India and Vietnam, able to, in many cases, offer the same product or service, at a similar or less cost. Should companies still consider China? If there's a certain capability that exists in China that does not exist elsewhere that they're using, then I think you're probably going to see countries still, do business there. However, I do also think you'll see countries starting to examine those capabilities and see if they can be sourced or developed elsewhere as well. So short term, I think companies still are doing business at this, in many cases. I think long term, it remains to be seen yet.
Well, thank you both, gentlemen, for talking with me. This has really been an enlightening conversation. I really appreciate you, and thanks to our audience as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.